Hey world, hey world history students. All right, we are on the last section of our World War II Note Booklet. So let's go ahead and finish that. So pull up your notes if you haven't done so already. Scroll on down to booklet 4, and we are going to go over that together. All right, the first section, home front and aftermath of war. When people say home front, they're referencing what's going on back at home. So if someone's fighting in, let's say, in America, American soldiers are fighting in Europe, the home front is back at home, back in America. All right. World War II was a total war. Fighting covered most of the world. Countries had full economic mobilization, and nearly 20 million civilians died. So, if you guys remember back to a previous chapter, we talked about total war. And total war meaning it's not just the military that's fighting or involved in the war, but it is every aspect of the society within a country is geared towards fighting this war. So, families at home might be working at factories that are producing tanks and airplanes and ammunition, or maybe people even in the homes are doing things like planting and growing victory gardens so that the big farm foods can be grown and sent to the soldiers. Just everybody is participating in the war effort, no matter if you're a soldier or even a citizen at home. And remember, this was a true world war. It's going on over in Asia. It's even going on in Africa, and clearly and obviously in Europe as well. And as I said, nearly 20 million civilians died in the war. So this isn't just soldiers dying. There are innocent civilians dying as well. All right. So on the Soviet front, so this is what we now call Russia. Remember, it was the Soviet Union at this time. So the Soviet-German War is widely considered the greatest of the battles in World War II. The city of Leningrad experienced a 90-day siege. The civilians became so desperate they began eating dogs, cats, and mice. About 1.5 million people died in the city. So as Germany is moving into the Soviet Union, they're picking off these cities and trying to go along. And they just completely cut off Leningrad. They keep the city in the Soviet Union, Leningrad, from being able to get any messages out and any resources in, which ultimately ended up starving the people within the city. And 900 days, remember, that's 2.5 years that they're not able to get stuff into the city. And so 1.5 million people die in the city. As German soldiers made their way into Soviet territory, Soviet workers dismantled and shipped factories into the interior of the country. So if you remember back when we talked about Napoleon and Napoleon sweeping his way into the Soviet Union, and the Soviet people, which were Russian people at the time, would abandon their cities and burn the towns down so that Napoleon could not use any of the resources, and then eventually got stuck in the winter. Well, this is a similar strategy, but instead of burning everything down, what the Soviets were doing was they would essentially dismantle a whole factory, take it all the way down, and then move it further into their own country, build it back up so it could be used. That way, Germans, as they were moving into the country, couldn't take advantage and use those resources and those factories of the Soviets. Germany was known for doing that. As they would take over other countries, they would use their resources and their factories so that the people back in Germany wouldn't have to suffer or could continue to use everything for their own home front. The Soviets were, possibly more than any other country, fully invested in industrial mobilization. Because of focus on military goods, Soviet citizens experienced shortages in food and housing. So think of all of the industries within a country, completely focusing on building and making things for the war effort. So instead of farms growing what they would usually grow and factories making what they would usually make, instead it's all geared towards the war effort, which is good for the battle, good for the soldiers, good for the war, but not so good for the people back home that are trying to lead as normal of a life as they can, because then they're going to have less resources and less food for themselves. Women of the Soviet Union, like many other countries, played an important role in the war effort. Women and girls worked in industries, mines, and railroads, as well as digging anti-tank ditches, and worked as air raid wardens. So air raid warden would be like warning people if the air raids were coming, working on radios and stuff like that. Again, war continues to be situations where women gain more power. As men are fighting in the war, women are taking on more responsibilities that weren't available to them before. And usually that's good for the women's movement, because people who maybe didn't believe so before understand that women are just as capable as men, if not more so, in doing a lot of these things. The Soviet Union was also the only country in World War II to use women actually in battle. Women served as snipers and in bomber squadrons. All right, so the United States front. The U.S. home front was much different than the rest of the major powers in World War II. The U.S. was not fighting on its own territory and became the arsenal for the Allied powers. So remember, all of these countries that are involved in the war is generally going on in their country as well. So if you're in Europe, battles are happening in Europe. If you're in Asia, battles are happening in Asia. If you're in Northern Africa, battles are it's happening all over the world. But if you're in North America, specifically the United States, Canada, Mexico, then there's not battling going on in those countries. So it's going to be a different experience for the people in those countries. So what the United States was able to do was they could build up all of their stuff. They don't have to defend their own borders the same way. And so they can use what their factory and stuff is creating to send it to their allies. Winston Churchill believed the war would be won with industrial power and had full faith in the U.S. once they dedicated themselves to war. So Winston Churchill, if you remember, is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, United States' biggest ally. And he believed that whoever would have the best and strongest industrial power would have the advantage in this war. And he knew that once the United States fully dedicated their economy and their factories to the war effort, then it was going to give a huge advantage to the Allies. The United States workers were twice as productive as Germans and 5 times as productive as Japanese. So once the United States started turning their economy to a wartime economy, it was incredibly productive and helpful for the war effort. The dedication of the country to war economy caused some social problems. The construction of new factories created boom towns. Now, Mr. Chris's class, if you've already taken it, then you'd recognize this term. If you haven't taken it yet, you'll learn a lot more about what boom towns are. But essentially, it is any place that jobs opened up a lot due to the war effort, which were often because of factories. Whole towns would pop up, hence the reason they're called boom towns, because they would boom and all of a sudden there'd be a town there around this factory or industry where people came because they could get jobs. Problem is, usually the towns weren't in great conditions, and then as soon as the factories didn't have anything to make, or they couldn't transition from a war economy to non-wartime economy, the towns usually failed, and it was a really bad situation for a lot of people. The presence of new workers, especially African Americans, led to heightened tensions and sometimes race riots. So now all of a sudden you have people who are mixing together that hadn't mixed together before. And as is typical in American history, there was a lot of race tensions in that happening. Japanese Americans faced even more serious issues. Over 100,000 Japanese Americans were removed and sent to internment camps. Officials claimed the policy was necessary for security reasons. So remember, the United States is fighting against Japan, and Japan was United States enemy number one in this war. So government officials feared that Japanese Americans would be more loyal towards Japan than they would be towards America. So they literally round up Japanese Americans and put them in these detention camps, what we called internment camps. They weren't death camps or necessarily labor camps like we learned about going on in Nazi Germany, but they were terrible condition camps nonetheless. It's like sending people to prison who were just trying to live their life. All right, the German front. So what's going on in Germany? To begin World War I, Germans cheered the soldiers as they marched to war. In World War II, Germans did not care. So all of a sudden, remember World War I, we watched what was the name of the movie we watched? All Quiet on the Western Front, where people are literally cheering and excited to go to war. Well, World War II, not quite the same thing. Hitler believed the collapse of the home front was what cost Germany in World War I. So he understood its importance. He believed that the morale back at home in Germany is the reason that Germany didn't win World War I. So he believed that if he could keep morale high among German citizens and people supporting the war back at home, then it could ultimately lead to helping win the war. So to maintain morale in the first 2 years, Hitler refused to cut consumer goods or increase production of armaments. So like these other countries we're just learning about, that their home front becomes dedicated towards producing and getting ready for the war, Germany's trying to keep the home front as normal as possible. So instead, what they're going to do is they're going to start taking over other countries and using their resources to supply the war effort. So the Blitzkrieg gave the Germans quick victories and allowed them to take the resources of these other countries. Germany could avoid taking resources from their civilians back home. So if they can take the resources of Poland and France and all the countries they're invading, they can keep life back in Germany as normal as it could. When the war began to shift, so we're talking from Germany winning to also now Germany starting to lose, with losses in Soviet Union and the United States entering into the war, Germany's economic situation changed. That should be economic situation. Bam. Hitler finally increased armament production and the size of the army in 1942. Hitler appointed Albert Speer as a minister for armaments and munitions. So all of a sudden, as the war is starting to change and not go in Germany's favor as much, he says, all right, now we got to start producing at home. Life at home is going to change a little bit. Speer tripled the production of armaments between 1942 and 1943 in spite of Allied air raids. So even as the Allies are bombing all of these Axis-held territory and factories, they're still increasing their production of war stuff, largely armaments or weapons. Germany held off the total mobilization of the economy until July 1944. It was too late to save Germany in the war effort. So Germany was trying to keep from total mobilizing their country like other countries had done because they feared that it would keep them from winning because people back home wouldn't support the war as much. But eventually they had to, but it was too late. The German attitude towards women progressed during the war as women were given more responsibility in society. All right, now on the Japanese front. By the time Japan entered the war with the United States, Japan already had an economy in high gear after 4 years of fighting with China. So remember in Crash Course, they talk about sometimes you have dates that are easy to point to when a war starts, but it's almost never that clear. And that's an example of this. Um, it's easy to point towards Pearl Harbor for when the United States entered the war, or the invasion of Poland when Germany starts World War II in Europe. But Japan had already been fighting China for years before all of this. So Japan was already well established as an economy geared towards total war. The Japanese government had control over prices, wages, labor, and resources. So, whereas in the United States, you guys are more used to a free market determining things, the government not pointing out and saying, this is what the prices are going to be, this is how much people are going to get paid, and this is what's going to be made. But that was what was going on in Japan. Japanese tradition of obedience and hierarchy were used to encourage citizens to sacrifice their resources and even their lives for the national cause. So traditionally, Japanese people were very obedient and believed in this hierarchy of society and following what their government and what the royal family of Japan said and did. And so people were willing to give up their own resources, make their own life more challenging, and, as we'll see here in a second, even give up their lives for the sake of their country. So an example of that would be Japanese pilots were encouraged to sacrifice their lives by using their planes as bombs. These pilots were called kamikazes. So what would happen is Japanese pilots would be fighting. They would only give the pilots enough fuel to get to their destination, not just to return, or not to return as well. So Japanese plane would fly to wherever they're going, maybe Pearl Harbor in one instance, and they would shoot at the boats, they would shoot at the other planes, they would drop bombs. But eventually, once they're out of weapons, they would just take their plane and fly it into whatever the target was, and all of a sudden making their plane a bomb itself. And they're sacrificing their life for the cause of the war in their country in the process. Which in turn would make it really hard to fight Japan when people are so willing to sacrifice their lives for their country. Whereas most people around the world are willing to give up and be taken captive. Japanese people weren't willing to do that. They would fight all the way until their death. Japanese traditionalism kept them from mobilizing women in the war. So like other countries where women are involved in the war effort, Japan, that's not happening. Hideki Tojo, the Prime Minister of Japan, from 1941 to 1944, believed it was important to have women in the home as wives and mothers. And the quote is, "We are able to do our duties only because we have wives and mothers at home." So in his thought, the people serving in the war and fighting the war able to do what they're doing because they know back at home they have their wives and moms that are taking care of the home, taking care of the family, taking care of everything at home. Instead of using women as workers to fill positions, they brought in Korean and Chinese people to do the work. So as they're taking over these other countries, remember we said they've been doing this imperialistic expansion well before the World War II had started in our eyes. They start taking prisoners of war from other countries, Korea and Chinese people, and making them do the factory work that women might be doing in other countries. Japanese women received the right to vote in 1947. So after World War II, women then gained the right to vote. Remember, this is about 30 years after women got the right to vote in the United States, which the United States was late Anyway, so terms to know for this section: boomtown, cities that quickly, uh, should say, flew in population. I think that quickly. Oh no, grew. Why does it say few? Grew in population, often causing a housing shortage. All right. I think this is the last section. So, bombings. Bombing was one of the most common and successful tactics during World War II. Bombing civilian populations was frowned upon, but became common practice in the war as a way to force governments to make peace. So, usually, historically, you don't attack citizens of countries. You only attack soldiers and military targets or resources, stuff like that. You don't attack citizens. But countries started doing it anyway, as exampled by United States dropping an atomic bomb, or air raids happening in London, or various cities in Germany where civilian targets are being attacked as well. And the goal was, if we can make morale go down so much within the country that those people will eventually give up and not support the war, and it'll be hard for that country to fight in the war. London, England was the first city to sustain long-term bombing. For months, Germans bombed London every single night. Thousands of civilians were killed and enormous damage was done. The footage of this is remarkable and sad, but amazing. For months, people are having to live through this bombing. Imagine having to live in a way that every night you and your family have to go to bed in a bunker or somewhere you think will be safe, not knowing if your home, your school, the place you work, or even where you currently are is going to be bombed and destroyed that evening. Just every single day. And then the next day, people come out and they see the damage done. One of the things that Winston Churchill was known for was walking through the streets in public during the day to see damage and see the people. And that helped the morale of the people a lot. So despite the constant bombing, which you'd think would just terrify and make living conditions so challenging that people would want to give up and surrender this war, that act of courage and bravery and resilience that both Winston Churchill, but really the civilians of London showed, helped them fight through this war and eventually turn the tide of Germany's effort of bombing them and eventually choose a different target. In spite of the damage done to the city and people, despite the damage done to the city and people, British morale remained high. The Blitz, or German air raid, became a national experience. The bombing spread to other cities and towns in Great Britain. The high morale of Londoners set a good model for the rest of the country. Britain believed, like the Germans, that bombing civilian cities would force a country into peace. The British bombed German cities, expecting to break civilian morale and bring victory. So the Germans aren't the only ones who are bombing civilian populations in cities. The bombings added to the terror of life in Germany that was already suffering from food, clothing, and fuel shortages. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 caused a firestorm that may have killed up to 100,000 people. Millions of German buildings were destroyed and 500,000 civilians died due to the bombing. Despite the wreckage, German morale did not break. The destruction of transportation and fuel supplies were the most effective use of bombing. So not only are you trying to tear down people's morale and stop a country from wanting to be in the war, but if you start destroying their transportation and their fuel supplies, that keeps their war effort, their ability to fight, way down and makes it really hard for them to fight. Japan became vulnerable to air raids after their air force was depleted later in the war. Japan was especially vulnerable because their buildings were flimsy and easily caught fire. By the summer of 1945, many of Japan's industries had been destroyed, along with 1/4 of its homes. The bombing of civilian populations reached its peak with the U.S. dropping of the atomic bombs in August 1945. Even before that, so let's go back up to here. So, because Japanese homes and buildings were often made of wood and not made out of cinder like a lot of other countries, firebombing would destroy huge amounts of cities because the fire would spread and catch everything on fire. So, bombing in Japan was highly effective even before the atomic bombs ended up getting dropped. But back to that. So, the death tolls of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are rough estimates and can't be known for sure, but by December 1945, upward of 120,000 people died in Hiroshima and 80,000 people died in Nagasaki. Tons and tons of people, thousands and thousands of people are said to have died afterwards for years to come due to the radiation that the atomic bombs created. And so death totals, I'm sure we could look them up and find estimates, but they're really hard to do. But these numbers are people who died nearly instantly. It's a hard thing to talk about in American society because it was ultimately what pushed Americans to victory in the war. But it's also, over 200,000 people dying nearly instantly due to something that we did and maybe could have avoided, but potentially at the risk of deaths in other ways. Remember, one of the things we talked about was it worth sending American troops into Japan and losing a lot of American troops, but maybe saving civilians on the Japanese side? Ultimately, the Americans decided to drop these bombs and win the war, and this is going to end up sparking the Cold War following this. All right, I think that's the end of our notes. All right. If you guys have any questions on this, remember you can email me and go back and pause the video at any point if you need to catch anything that you missed. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will talk to you guys soon.